Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Wild and Unprotected. I'm your host Ethan Leaman, and I'm here with my co-host Koji Sumalde.
Hey everyone, welcome back.
In this week's episode, we talk sharks with Bryan Legare of the Center of Coastal Studies.
Let's start the show.
Wow. And I'm an elephant, I'm a sexy duck. Wanna get in one, I'm a rhino, I'm a hornet toad. Netherlands to Borneo.
There's always the classic just toss them overboard when you're sitting having lunch or, just anything of that.
The classic.
We actually were joking about setting up an OnlyFins account.
Here's to us all swimming through the shit and making more sense of it.
Wow, and unprotected. Planet Earth, we can't neglect it. Nature sexy, we need this place, so please respect it.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Wild and Unprotected podcast. Today we have someone special. He's a seascape ecologist at the Center of Coastal Studies and a PhD candidate at UMass Amherst. Welcome everyone, Bryan Legare. This one's going to be a good one.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So first off, before we get started, can you explain what a seascape ecologist is?
Yeah, so the big thing I do is I like to, I'm trained in fish and fish movement, also in quantifying habitat. And what a seascape ecologist really does is connects the fish movement and behavior to the habitat itself. So individually, each data set's like cool and important, but together it elevates it to another level.
It sounds like you're putting together, different pieces of a puzzle to see kind of a grander picture.
Yeah, no, it's when you're collecting this type of data, if you can understand what the fish are doing and what they need from the ecosystem, but also attach it to a place. That place you can identify and then protect, versus just saying that, a fish needs seagrass or eelgrass. That's nice, but if you say it needs this patch of seagrass or eelgrass, that allows you to actually, do some management actions.
Yeah, and it's quantifiable as well. You can make, more quality movements on changes when you're able to identify those types of things. That's
Yeah.
great. With that specific information, do you work with specific species?
Yeah, so my main focus is, I started the shark ecology program here at the Center for Coastal Studies. So I mainly focus these days on shark and shark movement and how that relates to the habitat that they occupy, and often habitat that we occupy with them.
That's awesome. So why sharks?
Well, sharks. I'm a fish guy, and sharks are often a bigger fish with a pointy end. But they are a important predator and mesopredator and of the ecosystems that they occupy. So protecting them allows you to really help out the ecosystem as a whole.
It's so interesting because we talk about apex predators as being the top, but also being mainly the least protected. When it comes down to, sharks and exactly what you study, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing as an ecologist, from the conservation standpoint, but also just as a regular consumer / regular old human being?
So from the conservation aspect, it's as much science and as much data we collect, it's only a small fraction of you know of what can be done and what needs to be done. So there's so much unfunded science out there and so much to do in so little time that we're not answering all the questions that we need to. And that translates directly into like the consumer, because if someone asks me like what fish to eat or where do we need to protect, or what's going on, what's the next question, I've got the next question, but I can't answer those other ones unless we fund science properly.
Yeah, funding seems to be a big issue, kind of all around conservation. I know that's, an issue that we face for conservation content, but it seems that's kind of almost the major blocker that we seem to face as a society in order to really move forward on certain projects.
Yeah, no, like the equipment I put out in the ocean that I hope I get back, it's $2,500 per station, and for the data that I need to collect and to answer the questions I'm looking at, which sounds simple, but I need 60 of these receivers. So at $2,500 a pop, and that doesn't include boat time, the captain, gas, my time, and the whole 9 yards. It's hard to sustain a science project and program in the current climate.
Yeah, and we were told by one of our last guests that, oceanography and that study is, at this point, it's a privilege just due to cost alone. It's definitely not something that's, sustainable without proper funding.
Yeah, no, it takes a lot of wrangling to get it done. I'm not trained to uh, go after money, to fundraise, to do events in the whole 9 yards. I just happen to be better at it than some. But for me to be a scientist, I'm a scientist 40 hours a week, and then the other 10 to 20 hours a week, I'm writing grants and trying to do events and trying to fundraise, and it's a whole other aspect of this job that people don't realize, which is above and beyond trying to get good science out there.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because, Koji and I are familiar with that, the grant portion of things. But our audience might not be. So let's dive a little bit more into that. I don't think people get to hear enough about that side. What exactly do you have to do, and what's that process like?
Yeah, so it all depends on who the funding source is. So a lot of grants you can get from towns, counties, states, or the federal government, but also foundations, private foundations can fund stuff, and each one of them has a different a purview, like different goal with that grant funding. So if you find a grant that fits the research or your research program, you apply to that grant. And for example, some of these ones from the federal government they may have $2 million available that year, and they want to fund 10 to 20 projects. And the project is, let's say, 2 years long. So your max $100,000 project for 2 years, and that is sounds like a lot of money, but it's not. But you also might have 1,000 different scientists applying to that same pot of funding. So you're competing with your friends, you're competing with the general ecosystem of grant writing, and you have to produce this extensive proposal with the hope that you get that funding. So it adds extra time and stress and energy to something that has a small chance of getting funded.
It's a really good peek behind the curtain.
Yeah.
And that kind of, like you said, Ethan, lets people in to see, you got to really have a passion for this, to want to do that, to want to rip your hair out 95% of the time that you're at work just to get some money to be able to, like you said, get good science. I think that's a very underrated, perspective of looking at conservation. And when it comes to nonprofits specifically, one thing I want to know is how do you balance that, as a scientist, and as you need 60, stations that cost this much. You already have your year planned out of what you need to do. How do you balance that with the science part of it?
The science part of it's, to me, kind of the desktop science part of it's the easier part, trying to get, because it's the fun part. It's what I want to do. So you always make time for that. But it's the fundraising, the running around town, doing talks to, with the hope of the donation, setting up, talking to different political individuals to see if we can get, different funding sources coming through, donors who all have their own different avenue that they want to, fund, but it may not, you have to line things up. What I like to do, and what I did with this project, is I started in 2019 with just, 20 stations at one beach, to say, because I knew what the data would look like, and I knew the technology, but without the visuals, without the presentation, like, it was hard to sell. So once I got the first set of what we call pilot data, I was able to say, hey, look at this. And then it got people excited. So that was 2019, and it took years to really get it into like a full program where we're really getting the type of data that we need to answer these questions.
Yeah, and speaking of that current project, what is that?
Yeah. So my main focus is I look at how white sharks on Cape Cod use shallow water. So how they travel through it, what their behavior is, how often they're there. I take the same technology that's used by the state and other researchers to track the sharks, but I put them in close proximity to each other. And by doing so and then arranging it in such a way, I can triangulate the shark's position down to about the meter. And what I bring to the table at the Center for Coastal Studies is we have a very sophisticated mapping program, a mapping boat, in which we can go out and map the sea floor in both shape and habitat to see how they're using the bars and the troughs and different tide cycles and where the seals are to create this profile of behavior in an area that we share space with them. So on one hand, it's super cool biological information, and on the other, it's information that the general public and managers can directly consume and say, this is how I want to share space with a white shark, which is generally shallow water.
Now, how shallow are we talking?
You read my mind, Koji.
What I generally recommend is following the guidelines that the National Park Service puts out. They're called the Shark Smart guidelines, and they're fitting very well with the data. And what they suggest is going about chest deep at the most. Not swimming near seals is a big component. If you go just beyond where the surf breaks, that tends to be where they're traveling through the most.
Oh, wow. So like actual surfers could be at most risk.
Yeah, if you're going out that far, that tends to be the area that the sharks are concentrating and moving up and down the coast.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, so let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about how you got to the Center for Coastal Studies.
So everything looks linear in hindsight, but it definitely wasn't. So I graduated undergrad from UNH back in 2007. I worked on a couple fish farms here and there. I then was trying to figure out my life as a biologist and just discovered I really needed a master's. So I went to the University of the Virgin Islands where I tagged baby sharks and checked out their nursery habitat on St. John and quantified their residency and presence in a important habitat down there. Then after that, I came back to the States. Well, that's part of the United States, but territory. Came back to Massachusetts, worked for a summer, and then ended up in Texas for 3 years, mapping oysters and doing oyster restoration. But what that did is it taught me how to do these mapping scenarios. So after 3 years in Texas, I decided to find a new job. Ended up here in Provincetown at the Center for Coastal Studies in the seafloor mapping program. And what has allowed me here at the center is they said I could write grants and get projects going. So after time, I was able to do that and develop my own project and program.
That's amazing, taking that next step kind of from, not necessarily an introductory job, but an introductory job into the Center for Coastal Studies and then building out your own program. I don't think people traditionally with their 9-to-5s could ever move into any role with the company or an organization and be like, yeah, I'm going to do this for a minute and then expand in their entirely own project. And that's an incredibly cool side of conservation and working with organizations like this that people don't realize. You have a passion for something. If you're able, to speak kind of eloquently and get donations behind you and funding behind you, you can really start whatever program it is that you want, working with different organizations. And that's an amazing piece of this that most people don't get to see.
Yeah, no, it's I've been fortunate enough to do that, and with this project, I was able to start my PhD in 2019. Where I'm an employee at the Center for Coastal Studies, but through networking and stuff like that, I was able to leverage my employment and my project as a dissertation subject.
That's great. You're like kind of killing two birds with one stone there.
Yeah, no, it's like I said, it's not linear. But the biggest advice I always give to like new students and stuff like that is I didn't come back to working with sharks by continuously saying I have to work with sharks. I got back to working with sharks by building my skill sets in different avenues, and I worked on oysters for 3 years. I built 420 acres of oyster reefs in 2014 in Texas, doing large scale restoration efforts. But that experience got me here to do shark work.
Dang, sounds like you came out of your shell.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's
Jesus.
Well, see, that's something that people don't understand. Like, it's not linear, like you
No.
said. Like, I don't think when you first started, you were expecting to be, to have your own program around sharks. Definitely not when you were building out oysters.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a learning curve on trying to figure out what the hell is available and is out there, but also, there's always different things that you have to level. Is it family? Is it salary? Is it this? Is it that? And like, I had to make choices about, what was important to me and what was, also paying my bills and also being stable and also like, what I could do family wise and the whole 9 yards. And all those things guided it because, coming out of a master's and undergrad with student loans at 6.8%, sucks. So
I can relate.
yeah, it really guided like, do I want to take this job at $12 an hour with a master's, or do I have to take that job for, 18 to, even though it's something I necessarily didn't want to do, but like you had to.
Yeah. Well, looking at your route, and the course of your career, you doing it when you did and how you did it. For those listening, do you think it could be possible to do today something similar?
Yes and no. Like there isn't a lot of stories out there because of the climate of like education and jobs. Um, the biggest piece of advice I always give to someone is always just weigh all those different options. If it's the right scenario about going back to school, then go back to school. But like getting a PhD, uh, or even a master's, you don't have to do it right away. You can stabilize yourself and you can get yourself moving and get some experience under your belt. And then you're going to be actually a better student in the long run if that is something that you find you need to do.
I would agree. And, even just as important as that stabilization is networking.
Yeah.
Once you get in and you can network, especially in this kind of industry, I feel it sets you kind of above everyone else more than education does almost at this point.
Yeah, no, it's networking, get your name out there, trying to, like being excited about what you're talking about makes it easy to sell it. And what I've been able to do with these projects and stuff like that is I've been friends have laughed at me when I'm at a bar in town and someone asked me about what I do and I've talked to them and they like, oh, Brian's going off on his shark thing or whatever. And but it's fun to talk about. It's fun to get across, and also giving talks in bars while having a couple really helped me hone in my speech.
Yeah, I'm sure that was helpful with donors, but I also feel like you have a secret weapon, and it's that epic mustache.
Well, it's it's my long COVID. I got it. I was part of the Delta outbreak that happened in Provincetown in 2021. The one that we discovered that a vaccinated person could pass it on to a vaccinated person. And what was one cool about that is the cool science that came out of actually like the contact tracing and the genetics and stuff like that. But what was even cooler is after quarantine in a couple of weeks, I'm like, I'm going to try something different and grew this mustache.
Well, I'm sure that really helps with the funding because it's pretty awesome.
I've always had facial hair, and I've never had any scenario in which people will literally randomly come up to you and be like, start talking about the mustache. It's fucking weird.
Well, it sounds like you got another donor right here.
Yeah, well, that works.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah, no, it's always putting a face on things is always good. And but some scientists are good at it, and some scientists aren't. But the important thing is, a scientist being good at being a scientist. So
Yeah. And identity helps too. When you're building essentially a brand for yourself as you're going from donor to donor and working with, potential politicians and things like that, being a great scientist and on top of that having a recognizable brand, I think is just as important.
yeah, which does suck for some of those who are some of the best scientists in the world, but like aren't a public face. It causes sometimes things get lost in that. And again, that's the nature of the funding cycle.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it works.
Well, fast forwarding, to your current project, I know we touched base on, you working in Cape Cod and studying the ecology of shallow water sharks now. Day in and day out, do you have a team that works with you? Of course, you're going to be running around doing the funding aspect and the donation aspect that you need to do, but are there other scientists that work closely with you, or are there other, fundraiser type people that help you out, or is it just Bryan and the mustache going full force?
It's mainly Bryan and the mustache. I'm a program of one, but I do have partners. I work with the Division of Marine Fisheries here in Massachusetts and the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy on, the broader aspect of, shark research in the area. We coordinate stuff. I have my array which tracks the sharks, and then, they're droning and doing drone surveys over those arrays so we can discuss how efficient using a drone is for actually finding sharks in the shallow water, because the water here is extremely turbid, it's moving fast, the sharks are hugging the bottom, so like visual sightings of these things are actually a lot less than you would think. And so again, we can quantify that. But here at the center, we share boat captains, we share different things. But for the day to day, it's me behind this desk and running around town. Every day is different. Building gear, getting stuff done. I work a lot with our seal biologist. We're trying to develop some projects around Cape Cod. But again, she's a program of one as well, and trying to get us synchronized so we can answer some cool questions.
Do you think your program will ever expand to, pending funding?
It's all pending funding. If I could hire a second person, I would. But I would need to justify that with the funding and the projects and stuff like that. And yeah, but that would add another, with overhead and the whole 9 yards, another $100,000 a year. That's not their salary, but that's the reality of turning on lights and healthcare and all the other shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a heavy burden, and I can fully understand that. Starting this program with Wildscape, you look at every individual person, as a human being and what they contribute to the program, but then you also look at it from the business side, and you're like, fuck, this is expensive.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, how I look at it on a lot of this, from I'm not going to ask someone to give up their future and their savings and the whole 9 yards to just, to struggle here. There might be other opportunities out there that they can, work at and not struggle, or they can be in a place where they could support and not be in the field, but support in different ways. Because as you guys know, like what's a retirement account? It's something
Wouldn't know that.
Exactly. It's something that when you hire someone, giving them a livable wage in which they can actually build a future on that's important to me. Especially in an expensive place like Cape Cod.
And especially in today's climate as well, the financial climate is just, it feels like it's almost looking more bleak by the day. And it makes it really difficult to really build a good team, that could provide that level of research, in your case or in our case, that advocacy. I mean, it's really difficult to build out. But, there is hope because there are, really good people and, people like yourself who are amazing, with working with donors. And I feel comfortable saying that because if you're supporting your own program, I would say that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, no, and it's year by year, so we'll see how. I think I should be good through the end of next year, kind of, but I'll try to shake some trees.
Well, we'll add a little plug at the end of the episode for you.
And just we'll include a donate button too, along with ours. Shameless.
Well, it's not shameless when you have to do it.
Yeah, we got to keep the lights on at some point, or in our case, we got to keep the podcast on, the on-air sign.
Well, that's great. It's nice to kind of dive in further because I know we just grazed the surface with you, Bryan. And I feel like it's finally starting to get to the point where, we're getting to know a little bit more about what you do and kind of understand fully where your brain's at and what you do day to day. I think that's a good transition into our next segment. We talked about sharks, we talked about Cape Cod, we talked about your history, talked about your day in and your one-man band, what it seems like. Let's talk about some things that might have happened in the past, because we've had some email conversations where you said you've done a lot of cool shit. Let's expound on a few of those things. Is there anything that comes to mind that you're like, wow, this is something that people need to hear, that something that Nat Geo wouldn't ask?
Yeah. Well, one of the coolest projects I've been a part of, and I'm trying to get going again, is I was looking at how juvenile sharks use nursery habitats in the Virgin Islands. This is a part of the world that is often neglected in many different ways, but also it's a hole in a lot of marine sciences because the funding doesn't get down there. We own the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, and then the British Virgin Islands are still under the thumb of the crown, where it's a place where it's hard to get stuff done, but it's such an important ecosystem that focus needs to be down there. And in 2009 to 2011, I did some acoustic tagging, just like these sharks are tagged up here, to quantify the nursery habitats in two embayments on St. John, Coral Bay and Fish Bay. And what was important about these two areas is they were just outside of being protected. They're just outside of national park boundaries. And Fish Bay, potential, residential development all around it, to get sedimentation going on. But Coral Bay has been under threat for the past decade of being developed into like a mega marina. And if that happened, we'd lose one of the most important shark nursery areas in the territory, in the region. So I've been able to get down there. You get off the boat and you have a burger with some chips at Skinny Legs, and after a long day of getting gross and fishing, and it's just a super cool part of the world. But I've been fortunate enough to start last year I was able to get down to the British Virgin Islands and do similar work in Tortola and Anegada, starting some work there. I'll be down there for 2 weeks this month, on the 19th to the 3rd, doing a second round of fishing for these guys, and hopefully next year we can expand that with, knock on wood, some grants I've recently submitted.
Well, fingers crossed those grants go through.
Yeah.
And we're excited to see that. We know that'll be huge for you, and especially because it's kind of connecting the dots back to your master's program.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's cool, and again, it's something that I can pinpoint and say these sharks need these habitats. When I say these habitats, this specific location, and if you do develop these embayments, you're going to lose that. And I'm not opposed to new development and new stuff, but we have the tools and we have the information to do that smart. And sometimes it's uh, just picking a different season to build something. Sometimes it's just not picking that area at all. So there's ways that we can move into the future, doing more smart development along our coasts and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I feel like that applies to, all aspects of life and business or any organization. There's always that saying, work smarter, not harder, especially in collaboration with other organizations, that work with things such as yourself. Um, since that almost seems like a really good point of growth kind of for anyone. What advice would you give yourself, your master self, now that you're kind of tying back and going back to the same almost area that you were in at that time? What advice would you give yourself then? What would future you tell past you?
It's probably, trying to wrap my head around my OCD and my anxiety around trying to get new jobs in the whole 9 yards, and just more going with the flow on things, and versus freaking out about stuff too much. Because an aspect of a lot of this too is like when we're going after funding and going after different grants and trying to find a new job that's not going to pay your bills. That is, in my mind, a huge contributor to like the whole mental health thing of our generation. The second I was able to pay off my student loans, it felt like a depression was lifted. Uh, it's this unspoken thing that is running around, and it's very prevalent in marine biology. Of just overworked, underpaid, and going into debt, unless you got a rich mommy or daddy that can pay your way, and which
Yeah, anyone know where we could find any of those?
yeah, not in my genetics, but uh,
Yeah, and I think we also live in a society that's so big on, praising those kind of actions. Like, yeah, go into, the Peace Corps or go into, conservation. And, they themselves would never do it, but they push people to do it and don't realize how difficult, those roads are, how expensive those roads are, and, how anxiety riddled the people who are in those fields are. It's a difficult road to walk. I mean, we're fringe case, really, with it being media based, so we can almost walk in both worlds. So I really say, we would only really have half the anxiety of anyone, especially in marine biology, would have, but it's still, it still has a presence nonetheless. So it's amazing to see society push towards that, but never recognize the back half of it, and kind of the damage that it can cost, without providing additional support.
yeah, because at the end of the day, I could quit and go into business and whatnot, and I go freaking nuts behind the desk doing the same thing every day. Like for my sake, I need the constant chaos that is the job as a scientist of doing something different every day. But when I step out of here at the end of the day, a little stability is nice.
Yeah, I could imagine. Well, I think we should dive into kind of the wild part of the show and see if you have any, potentially wild stories for our audience.
Yeah, no, like I've mentioned to you guys in the pre stuff, I've done some really cool shit out there. When I worked for the state of Texas, one of the things that helped keep me sane is I was working on the artificial reef program as well, which are ex-oil rigs. They're these massive, massive fucking structures underwater, and after 30 years of oil production, they were designed to grow and foul all along them. So they've got corals on them, they've got fish growing around them, and one of the scenarios is that they could be reefed and be kept as fish habitat. And as a employee of the state of Texas, is we'd go out there and do fish censuses, and I was able to get Trimix certified and go down to about 200 feet of water and touch the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, and that was nuts.
Holy shit.
Breathing helium and oxygen and nitrogen in funky concentrations and getting down there, staging
You're
yourself.
probably high as a kite.
Well, luckily, with the concentrations, I didn't get too narked like the first time I went down to about 130 feet. I was with a well-trained diver, and we get down there. Diving is one of my favorite things to do in the world. I do it as often as I can. I lead some trips for a LGBTQ scuba company a couple times a year called Underseas Expeditions that has allowed me to get to different places. But the first time I went deep to about 130, it was breathing air, which is perfectly fine to breathe at that depth. But I got nitrogen narcosis for a little bit, where you get a little drunk and a little high, and I'm like, you know, let me check my gauge. I think I should look at my gauge. I wonder what my gauge looks like. And it's I was with trained individuals who have gone through this multiple times, so it was a more safe scenario. But it was definitely an interesting experience.
Oh, I could imagine that sounds pretty crazy.
Yeah, no, it's like I've been able to get to one of the coolest trips I ever did is I joined a colleague who was a PhD student at Scripps at the time, and we went to the Sierra Cortez, and up right where the Colorado River should be flowing into the Gulf, into the Sierra Cortez, on the Pacific side, looking at this fish called the Gulf Corvina, um, where it spawns and it creates noise. It creates so much noise your boat vibrates. Because there's so many fish and they're just croaking. You turn off the engine and you can feel it and you can hear it in the air. And it was just one of the funkiest things around. And these little fishing villages that's the only source of income, is to fish this spawning aggregation. And if you know anything about spawning aggregation, you can often deplete the entire stock by getting the adults. But it was a super interesting area where you have these socio-economical forces of the only source of income for these villages is to fish, but you also have this important ecological scenario of a super unique fish spawning. So it was definitely a cool area. Yeah. No, like I said, there's some really cool shit out there, and as a marine biologist, I may not be paid the most, but I've been able to do some cool shit and go to some places that a lot of people haven't been able to go.
I'm sure for that it's worth it.
It gets there. Yeah. No, I definitely am fortunate to be able to see those things and whatnot.
Well, I think one of the last topics we can kind of talk about, and this is something that we went over kind of in our pre-production of the show, was how sharks are kind of portrayed in today's media. And I know this is something you kind of wanted to speak about, and it's something that we wanted to hear because it's very interesting. You see, Discovery does their whole Shark Week. And I think that's an interesting concept. I think there's, some good in there, but I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on, especially since you work with them, all the time, and that's your current program, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So, the big thing about sharks and, great whites and everything is, first, there's like, depending on the genetics and different things, there's like over 500 species of sharks out there. You only ever hear about 10 at the most. And they're cool, but there's so many other cool sharks out there that aren't apex predators. They may be mesopredators or and they are super important in the ecosystem, and some weird ones. You got the goblin shark, which people have heard of, that has extended jaw. The megamouth shark, which is gigantic but eats plankton. Even the basking shark. It's the second largest fish in the ocean. And they are just gnarly, cool animals. We get those around here on the Cape as well. But the big thing is whenever they're portrayed, there's always seems to be needing this hook that most of us shark scientists don't think it's needed. It's the hook that you're going to get bit and you're going to get attacked. I've been in the scuba diving with many, many, many sharks, and there really hasn't been scenarios in which I was nervous. I was, just because I'm in the water and a shark is in the water doesn't mean it's going to try to bite you. A lot of videos you see out there are either um, a wildlife harassment scenario where the person's approaching and touching or trying to get to the shark, or it's like a spear fisherman who's got bait on them and the fish is coming towards them. So there's a lot of overemphasizing on that. There's uh, where the story we really think is interesting is the story of the ecology of how the system works. Like the wolves in Yellowstone, where when you reintroduce those, it caused the elk and the deer to be afraid. So the elk and the deer weren't in the open, and it allowed different plants to grow more, which increased the plant biodiversity. We didn't know those direct and indirect effects, but those same things are playing out in the ocean, especially with things like the white sharks and the seals being allowed to repopulate these areas after being extirpated. It's going to allow the ecosystem to balance itself. Because if anything I know is that we're not good at balancing things. We're good at fucking things up, but we're not good at necessarily balancing things.
Yeah, and I think balance is an incredibly important thing, especially in society. We tend to put our eggs into one basket, or we tend to lean one way. We tend to go all in, as a society, and that's almost praised at this point when, balance is key to living a healthy and successful life, in my opinion. And, when it comes to this, media portrayal, it's definitely bullshit. There it shouldn't be like that. But that ties right back into how we are as a society is fear, drives clicks and drives views. And I think a lot of the larger media organizations, that have the funding to be able to do this shit, are moving that way because they probably have to. I'm not a fan of it, and you call a spade when you see it. But there's also an understanding, that even though it is bullshit, the major problem is with society and how they consume it and how that's what they want to watch. When in all reality, a shark doesn't have hands and can't be like, oh, I don't eat this normally. This isn't in my diet. So it's teeth and a mouth that they use to figure that problem out.
Yeah. And one thing though is, a lot of us have discussed that we don't think they would have, like, we think the story about the sharks in the ecosystem and all the weird ones out there and all the different stuff would sell and would be just as interesting as the fear-based stuff. But the fear-based stuff is easy and it's cheap, and the story of how like the lemon sharks are using these small nursery habitats, we believe that it would sell just as well. But it's hard to change habits on a lot of these media companies, and it sucks because people get the wrong perspective on things.
Well, I think this will be a shameless plug for us. That's what we're hoping to change.
But yeah, no, it's a weird world out there, with especially like I said, how the media portrays the things, and us trying to like segregate our time. Like, you guys, and no one's ever paid me for an interview. No one's paid for research and stuff like that. But we do it because we know it's important to get the proper word out there. And it really sucks when things are sold to us in a certain way, and then they're flipped on their head, and taken out of the context to make it sound like, oh, because we had this expert, our fear-based story is legit. And I'm not going to go jump in the water with a great white shark. It's not because I'm afraid of the great white shark. It's because I respect the great white shark. It's a scenario in which, I'm not going to push the boundaries of that just because it would be cool. No, I'm not going to go into its environment in which it's hunting, and it's got a purpose of trying to find seals. And in that area, it's turbid and it's cold and it's funky and it's high current, and um, it doesn't make sense for me to disrespect that animal like that. Um, and that's what I really see it comes down to is respect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You wouldn't go into someone else's kitchen when they're trying to make a peanut butter sandwich.
Well, depending if it's smooth or chunky.
Are you smooth or chunky guy?
It all depends on the night. All depends. All depends. It depends on the strength of the edibles.
I second that.
Oh gosh, that's great. I think that's a great place to start the wrap on.
Yeah, no, it's been and it's fun getting this word out there. Like literally over here on my desk, I've got the receivers I'm gonna be throwing out there, getting those ready. But,
let's can you pick one up and show it, or is it small enough to kind of fit in the frame?
Like that's the office. Let's see. Those are the receivers. We've got everything on the ground. Yeah, it's
That's a barf bucket.
Potentially. There it goes.
Oh, it looks like a bottle of Nos.
So this was one that I had floating at the surface that was hit by a boat. So it's a casualty of $2,500, down the drain, no data. But now I get a cool desk toy.
Oh no, the camera's going limp.
It happens when you touch it too much.
Oh gosh, I love this episode.
What do you mean? I don't get it. No.
I don't either. We don't ever talk about anything inappropriate on this show ever. This is clean. Is there a C rating for clean? I don't think that's how that works. I know there's E for explicit. Yeah, that's the name of the show. Tame and Protected.
Fun.
All about that. Well, let's go ahead and we can start our wrap. One of the most important things, that we really like to push with our guests is that next step, kind of that call to action, and give our listeners the ability to reach out. So what are some ways that they can contact you? And then the most important thing is, what are some ways that they can send some donations or donors your way?
Yeah, so you can go coastalstudies.org. I've got a shark ecology page on there, and there's donate buttons all over the place. And if you donate and you want it to go specifically to the shark ecology program, just make that a little note in there. They, support shark science where you can. There's a lot of great organizations out there. But also at the center, if you want to support us in general, we do work on whales and, seafloor mapping and climate change and all kinds of other stuff. But coastalstudies.org is probably a good place. Also find us on, Facebook and Instagram at, Coastal Studies up here in Provincetown. You can follow us and see all our updates. I'm going to try to do a running journal article updates or whatever. Don't know the format yet for on Facebook and Instagram when I'm down in the Virgin Islands in a couple of weeks. That's going to be a little ad lib at the time, but we'll figure it out.
Well, we were super excited to have you today, and thank you so much for your time, Bryan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Wild and Unprotected podcast, brought to you by Wildscape Productions. Follow us on social media at Wildscape Productions. For more information on our documentary series, Shoreline Stories, visit wildscapeproduction.com. Stay tuned for our future episodes, as we have so much more in store for Wild and Unprotected.